You don't like that Miss Selim is the villain of that tale. That you are like Miss Selim, a potential threat, without a Shemshina to control you. He says this matter-of-factly, not as a question. Demaya squirms. How does he always seem to know what she's thinking? I don't want to be a threat, she says in a small voice. Then, greatly daring, she adds, but I don't want to be controlled either. I want to be... She gropes for the words, then remembers something her brother once told her about what it meant to grow up. Responsible.
The thing that I am eating right now that I think is in parallel with your wholly consumed Reese's Peanut Butter Cup wrapper and all. I've got some chili that I made earlier this week that I was like, this is like some C+ chili. It's like kind of bland. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a little undersalted. Like, it's fine if you put, like, some salt and some cheese on it. But you know the thing that really elevates it is if you put 2 cups of Red Hot Cheetos into the chili as you are cooking it.
Yeah, that sounds... So it's like chili locals.
Sí, es la verdad. Necesito una palabra que... que dice
or significa
sí muy loco
loquísimo
loquísimo
no sé el
loco sobre
miedra de los murciélagos
sí
plátanos.
Es un trabajador en progreso.
So, listeners, for those of you who speak Spanish, how do you say batshit crazy in Spanish? Or crazier?
Yeah, over the top craziness.
Over the top.
It's really taken my chili from C+ to like B-.
Yeah, that's yeah. I used to, one of my secret ingredients when I used to make crab cakes a lot was either red hot blue chips or just straight up Doritos pulverized and added to kind of like the the mixture, just because a lot of times some people will add some breadcrumbs to a crab cake. To help with the binding and I think in particular this would not be good for like salmon cakes, or there was something about crab and that kind of maltodextrin-y flavor that Doritos and Red Hot Blues have.
That just really like twisted the throttle.
It did.
On like, this is amazing.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, I had a girlfriend at the time who was quite fond of that secret ingredient.
You're sort of a connoisseur of... this is funny. This is a very upper middlebrow moment. My knowledge of you and cooking things is generally you're sort of at your best when you take a very lowbrow item, pulverize it, and then coat a much higher brow item with that coating. Like, I think one of my earliest experiences cooking with you involved pulverizing cornflakes in which to batter a piece of fish that maybe, I don't think we'd ever fished together. I don't think we caught it freshly.
Yeah, we probably got it from the market.
Yeah, probably went to Hannafed's.
Yeah, I vaguely recall it. In fact, last night I cooked myself a feast.
A birthday feast?
A birthday feast.
Because it is the day after your birthday.
It is. Although I don't like to publicize the official date of that. So, but yes, we're in early May.
A date that will be lost to time because podcasting recording happens in no time.
Yeah, exactly. People will be like, "It's in July." I made surf and surf. So grouper and scallops.
Okay.
And surf and chips, and really good handmade French fries, which is about as sort of a decadent camping meal I could come up with. I feel like that's about as good as I did. And I battered the grouper. The grouper was excellent, and I battered it with a combination of Louisiana fish fry that you get at the grocery store. I don't really like using cornflakes and things like that anymore. I don't like those really crispy things. I generally like to go with a seasoned flour. And then I added some hush puppy seasoning to just your point, because I didn't quite have enough of the Louisiana fish fry, and that was like the only other flour-like material that I had. And I also thought it would be good. And yeah, it was excellent. It was an excellent, and I don't know if it was the grouper itself or the combination of Louisiana fish fry, which is paprika heavy, and it's basically flour, paprika, probably pulverized onion, a few other little things in there.
Sounds great.
Yeah, and then there is a sweet onion quality to the hush puppy mix, almost like a kind of a cornbread mix, but not all that gritty. It was very ground very fine, and man, it was. I wasn't. I mean, I knew it would be good, but I was like, when I had the first bite of it, I was like, "Whoa, yeah, this is, yeah, we hit the jackpot here." And I mean, you don't. Also, like on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, they have fresh grouper that like somebody caught 40 miles away, which is not the case for most of America. We're actually sitting. I think this is about as close as you can get to actual grouper fishing grounds. We're so close to the Atlantic Shelf here. So yeah, that was exciting. And of course the scallops were great, but they were normally the scallops would be the highlight of the meal. They were basically just the appetizer. The only problem was that I had such a busy day that I had to clean my kitchen before cooking it, which involves boiling water. So I didn't actually start cooking till like 8:30. And then I was pretty tired. And at one point it was like 9:00. I had done all my prep, and the scallops were done because I only have 2 burners inside the camper. And I was like, I kind of just want to eat these scallops and go to bed because I'm kind of tired, but I powered through.
And got the reward. And totally seized the brass ring. Seized the prize.
It was one of the best bites. That first bite of fried grouper was definitely one of the best bites of a whole fish that I've purchased, or a fillet of fish that I've purchased and eaten in my life.
Wow.
In the top 5, I can think. And I'm
amazing.
not talking about restaurant grade fish, although I would have been very happy if I had gotten served this fish at a restaurant, and I've certainly been served worse, like beer battered, cod fish and chips before. So yeah, it was quite the win, and it's exactly in line with what you were saying. I didn't exactly use cornflakes, but I did use a couple of store-bought prepackaged mixes. But your compliment of me reminds me of something, and we may have joked about this when you first observed this, which it's a line from a later Neil Stephenson novel about Midwestern cooking. I think it might be Reamdy. But it could be another one where he says at one point he observes that Midwesterners were disinclined to use in their food substances which the rest of America referred to as ingredients. You meaning that all the recipes are like, take a can of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup and some cornflakes and some Velveeta. That's like all of the ingredients are actually fully formed foods of
other foods
in their own right.
Yeah, you want to get into it?
Yeah, let's talk books.
We're 16 minutes into rambling. Today, listeners, we are talking about N.K. Jemisin's the 5th season, the first part of the Broken Earth trilogy. She has won the MacArthur Genius Grant, which is pretty darn impressive.
Yes.
And I think really the other thing that's pretty amazing, she won 3 consecutive Hugos in a row, all for the Broken Earth stuff, which is just bananas.
Yeah.
Like if you actually think about the work that it would take to get 3 books out consecutively in the consideration period
in 3 consecutive years is what you're saying. Yeah, because I think there are a handful of writers who have won 3 Hugo Awards in their career.
I'm sure.
Although that's a pretty rarefied group right there as well, but 3 in a row, pretty
pretty nuts.
impressive.
Yeah, yep. You'd be up there. But let's see, some other stuff. She's worked for the New York Times Book Review. She's been an instructor. She's a gamer and a gardener. And she says that she's single-handedly responsible for saving the world from King Ozymandias, her dangerously intelligent ginger cat. I love any reference to Shelley's poem Ozymandias is a good one, so I'm happy to.
Well, and by way of Watchmen, I believe, if she's talking about saving the world. Although I don't know, I haven't read Shelley's Ozymandias, but
oh, it's really good.
Yeah.
It's very short. It's a sonnet. It's the look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Yeah.
Yeah.
Shout out to Diane Leahy, AP English teacher, and probably the person responsible for me sitting in this chair right now.
That and the chair salesman at whatever office.
This was picked up secondhand at a garage sale. So kudos to that person who lives on North Ivanhoe.
There you go. The two people responsible for you sitting in this chair.
Exactly. We're full of that kind of joke today. I love it.
Yeah, it's the old proximal cause joke.
Exactly.
It's like something out. It's like something out of Cheers. It's like a mistake that Coach would make in the first season of Cheers. Yeah. Well, obviously an impressive writer. Where do we begin in this recap? Do we do protagonists? Do we do chapters?
Yeah, let's talk about our three protagonists and then probably talk about the world itself a little bit. I think that seeing that you can't really do this book without the fact that the protagonists interact with the world literally on a seismological way.
Yep.
And so we need to talk about
and the world
the planet.
is sort of figuratively a character, and then also maybe literally a character as well, or at least a kind of hive mind like sentient. And one thing I think I'll just say too is that I purposefully did not read any recaps because there are mysteries in this book, and I didn't want to spoil them. And they're also, it's incredibly dense, and I think it's very easy to have missed little key details too. I certainly went. I've read the prologue 3 times now, because the prologue is incredibly dense, and it almost reads like a sort of poem that is full of clues. But yeah, do you want to start? Do you want me to start? Where should we start?
So we've got 3 characters. One is named Demaya. Not the first character we run into, but probably the easiest character to recruit. To recap. I just looked at the line in the rundown that says recruit. Demaya is our, probably the simplest protagonist because she slots really nicely into, the Luke Skywalker mold. She has some
Harry
powers,
Potter.
Or Harry Potter. Yeah, exactly. Any kind of book where, so many books. It doesn't even have to be a magical or fantasy book. Demaya has been discovered to have orogeny. Is that how we're pronouncing this?
I think that's how you say it, yeah.
Okay, Orogeny. People who display this ability are called orogenes. Or in these kind of slang dialect, they're simply called ragas, which is a very derogatory term. It is not something you would say in not even semi-polite company. It really feels like a word that should be avoided. Some, I think, probably pretty clear crossover to our own world.
Yes.
Where words with double G's that we tend to really try to avoid.
Yes.
Demaya is discovered to have orogeny. When you have orogeny, your nervous system basically connects to the seismological properties of this particular world and can cause earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, all sorts of bad things. Usually, orogenes are killed by the local populace. She is not. She is recruited by a guardian named Shafa. She is taken to a place called the Fulcrum, which is in the biggest city in this planet, which is called the Stillness, where she is going to learn how to control her power. We learn along the way some stuff about other historical origins and the role of the guardians, the guy Shafa who has come to take her to the Fulcrum. that he is there to protect her. He is also there to protect the world from her.
A little bit of both.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you say often killed or usually killed. It's a lynching. And there is what has happened. Shafa, the guardian, being sent to take Demaya is what is supposed to happen. That is the legal process in place in this world, but that is often not followed because people are terrified of these ragas, and so often they take it into their own hands. Another character, the first one we really meet, is Essen. I think I'm saying her name correctly. Who her chapters are rendered in second person, and in fact, often it does sound as though the narrator is talking to Essen. Remember who you are. You're Essen. Esun is the mother of Nasun, daughter, and Uche. But Uche has been murdered at the beginning of the book by her husband. He's been murdered because, in fact, it turns out he is an orogeny. And Esun knows this. She is also an orogeny, but she's been keeping that a secret. She keeps it a secret from her husband. She keeps it a secret from everybody in the town. She's been passing, indeed. And so Esun is mentioned in the very dense, very mysterious prologue, but then has a series of chapters where after she discovers her son has been killed, she sets out on her own. It's interesting, she has a couple of interactions with people in her village who are sympathetic, who behave, who know what she is or figure out that she's an orogeny and sort of try to help her get out safely, but it goes terribly. She loses her temper and ends up killing people, and it also turns out causing an earthquake, which is going to destroy the aquifers of this village. So basically, essentially, killing the village. People are going to have to leave because there's not going to be any water. She sets out on this quest to track down her husband, who's killed her son. Along the way, she becomes guardian to Moa, who appears to her to be a boy, but also we learn in the prologue, and she starts to learn, is something not entirely human. There's actually a quote from a academic treatise about these beings that refers to them as the non-human sentient entities. And there's another one at the very, I think, a being very similar to Moa in the very first scene of the book, who's sort of present at this sundering. And so the other thing I should say that's happening in Essen's timeline that you've identified is there's been a really big earthquake centered in the main city, Eumenes. I think this is the event that's described in the prologue. It is represented as potentially planet killing, although there are few clues that tell us it doesn't kill the planet, because at one point the narrator hints that Esun is going to sort of recreate civilization. There's a line that's something like, you wouldn't be here listening to this if it weren't for Esun, or something like that. So we know that in Esun's time, a very, very large earthquake has taken place, but Esun actually used her power to protect the lands around her, and now she's sort of wandering around in the post-earthquake landscape, along with Moa, who seems to have been created by the earthquake. He is born out of a kind of stone cocoon. He can eat glass like it's candy, and he can also apparently turn things into glass or minerals, which we learn in one of the latter chapters. And I think that's all we need to say about Essen. The other thing, I mentioned this already, but I think it's really, really important, is that her chapters are always rendered in the second person. So Esun is you. You're walking along the road. You look down. You see a boy. He's incredibly dirty. Like it's written that way. Whereas the other two protagonists are written in sort of limited third person.
Yeah. We even get some first-person narration in this book. I think we're going to probably talk about the different modes of narration here and there.
Yeah. First person from a kind of like omniscient narrator, or maybe sort of Homeric storyteller, like the person recounting this tale to the generation to come, the generation in the future of this time being, it sounds to me.
Yeah, it's a real like big N narrator voice in that case.
Big N, but also with personality. Not simply omniscient and dry, but omniscient and sort of conversational,
Yeah, willing to make even bad jokes about the things that this big N narrator is narrating. But I think we'll get to that when we talk about the prologue, because I imagine we're going to really talk about the prologue a bit today.
Yeah.
Our third main character is named Cyanite. That's spelled Syenite. When you are listening to this book, you spend the first few minutes of her chapter being like, cyanide?
I had cyanite like Cyanite.
And then I thought it was like the color. And then you start realizing that a lot of these origins end up taking on names of minerals.
Yeah.
That is their kind of like what happens when they get renamed. Cyanite is a fourth ringer at the fulcrum. Ranks are measured at the fulcrum by the number of rings that one wears on one's hand. Goes from 0 when you are a grit. You're basically a plebe or a first year, or insert
a
your
piece of
derogative beginning place, all the way up to 10 rings, which get worn on all fingers and thumbs of 2 hands. So Cyanite is basically a court concubine. Her role is to go and live with a 10-ringer named Alabaster, travel with him, and bear his children. He has done that several times before with other lower-ranking members of the Fulcrum. She is supposed to travel with him to a city called Alea, where they are going to fix a harbor. And along the way, they encounter almost a really bad seismological event, basically a mega eruption over a volcanic hotspot that was created by somebody called a node maintainer. Node maintainers are former Erogenes who we discover are put into really horrible circumstances where they're basically imprisoned in a chair, fed through tubes, kept from dying through basically nursing. They're pretty much vegetables. And they are also sometimes sexually abused by local populace. And this one, the reason that Erogenes can be dangerous is when they are emotional, they can lash out and create earthquakes and eruptions and things like that. This particular character has been abused in such a way that the emotions aren't dampened and they basically try to blow everything up. And even though that is averted through Alabaster and Cyanite's work, the node maintainer is killed, as is everybody at the particular node. They learn that, they see that. Cyanite, who at first really doesn't like Alabaster very much, begins to try to get to know him a little bit better, and then even helps save him when he is poisoned in the city of Alea. Anything I missed from Cyanite's arc?
You refer to her as a court concubine, which isn't untrue, but I think she is a skilled Orogeny who does get sent on missions to do actual she's not just, her job is not simply to have sex.
True.
And in fact, she's kind of one sense is she could maybe get Weasel out of this sexual assignment, but she's sort of choosing to go along with it because she thinks it will lead to kind of greater advancement up the ring rank system. And so,
Totally.
there's an interesting, these Orogenies both have power and have power over their own lives and other people's lives, but are also subject to control in an interesting way. Sort of not unlike the military, I suppose, although they don't volunteer.
Mm-hmm. True. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, control is probably one of the biggest themes in this book.
Yes.
That being able to control your orogeny is crucial to the people that practice it and their ability to stay alive, because if they can't control it, we learned that they are swiftly killed by their guardians.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's so many themes and motifs of control and losing control throughout the first half of this
people
book.
under other people's control in various ways,
yes.
and chafing against that, fighting against it, or accepting it, or negotiating with it in various ways. I think, yeah, control probably wins as the theme of the first half of the book.
And I think, you know, I mean, like that's one of the things that I really want to talk about today. Like, you can't think about this book without the specter of like American history lurking over it. There are references to slavery, but not our slavery.
Right.
And I think one of the impressive things that she does in this book is that all is there. That's all operating in the background as an illusion that we all get, but it doesn't seem to be the driving point. Like, that doesn't seem to be the thing that we're here for. So I think she does a very tasteful job in rendering all of those themes and probably having a very strong point that she wants to make about our world, while still very expertly crafting a narrative and a world that exists in its own way, with its own problems and traumas and horrors.
Did you notice the epigraph?
Yes, I noticed it because I also have heard her say this in other places.
Oh,
but do you want to go ahead and read it for us?
Sure. The book's epigraph is, or really more of a dedication. I don't know if it's an epigraph or a dedication. It sort of functions as both.
I would say this is a dedication, because I think for it to be an epigraph, it actually has to be a quote of somebody else.
Mm-hmm. For all those who have to fight for the respect that everyone else is given without question. And, you know, again, I think it's impossible, as you just said, to think about that and not think about enslavement and in the American context. But that's not what's going on exactly in this book, and actually seems like she's exploring sort of more of the gradations. I actually have a reading queued to the point you just made, so I could do that. Is that it?
Jump in there.
Okay, yeah. So this is pretty early on. This is when Shafa, the Guardian, is taking Demaya to Eumenes, to the Fulcrum. And he's told her a story about a very dangerous orogeny named Misalem, who was then threatening to destroy a city, but then was controlled effectively and killed by a guardian. They're riding along. Demaya is kind of sitting in front of Shafa on the same horse. He's rather large, and she's a child too, so he's physically much bigger. And it starts with dialogue from Shafa. "You're quiet now," says Shafa after a while, patting her hands on the pommel to bring her out of her reverie. His hand is more than twice the size of hers, warm and comforting in its hugeness. "Still thinking about the story?" She's been trying not to, of course, but she has. "A little." "You don't like that Miss Selim is the villain of that tale, that you are like Miss Selim, a potential threat, without a Shemshina to control you." He says this matter-of-factly, not as a question. Demaya squirms. How does he always seem to know what she's thinking? "I don't want to be a threat," she says in a small voice. Then, greatly daring, she adds, "But I don't want to be controlled either. I want to be..." She gropes for the words, then remembers something her brother once told her about what it meant to grow up. "Responsible. For myself." "An admirable wish," Shafa says, "but the plain fact of the matter, Demaya, is that you cannot control yourself. It isn't your nature. You are lightning, dangerous unless captured in wires. Your fire, a warm light on a cold, dark night, to be sure, but also a conflagration that can destroy everything in its path. I don't want to destroy anybody. I'm not bad like that." Suddenly it's too much. Demaya tries to turn to look at him, though this overbalances her and makes her slip on the saddle. Shafa immediately pushes her back to face forward with a firm gesture that says without words, "Sit properly." Demaya does so, gripping the pommel harder in her frustration. And then, because she is tired and angry and her butt hurts from 3 days on horseback, and because her whole life has gone wrong, and it hits her all at once that she will never again be normal, she says more than she means to. "And anyways, I don't need you to control me. I can control myself." Shafa reins the horse to a snorting halt. Demaya tenses in dread. She smarted off to him. Her mother always whipped her in the head when she did that back home. Will Shafa whop her now? But Shafa sounds as pleasant as usual as he says, "Can you really?"
What is it about that passage that speaks to you?
Well, I mean, you were just talking about control being the theme, and the relationship between Shafa and Demaya is so wonderfully complex. Demaya has been mistreated by her family, and when Shafa shows up, he scolds them. You know, they put her in a barn, they didn't give her what she needs. And Shafa also clearly cares about her, clearly pities her, and is also bringing her to a place where they're going to train her, where she actually probably can have a decent life if she plays by the rules. But at the same time, it's very clear that he's physically dominating her. When she turns around, he pushes her back into place. His hand's twice as big as hers. That is, in this passage, comforting to her. But later, you know, what happens shortly after the passage I just read is that Shafa executes a kind of test. The test, I mean, it's reminiscent of the Gom Jabbar from Dune. You know, he is testing to see if she can maintain her control when he inflicts pain on her. And he does it in a horrible way. He breaks her hand with his hand. And she passes the test. And after that, he's gentle and he's nurturing again. And I think in this, you see him both being kind, but also strict and also cruel and also controlling. And all of these things are happening at the same time. Demaya is reacting to both things. She both, you sense, is maybe kind of loves him, but also kind of fears him and also kind of hates him now. Two, she's making sense of all that. And also, I think, you know, you talked about enslavement in history. And when we think about systems of control and social control, it's rarely that the people doing the controlling are entirely evil, even if what they're doing is bad. There are people, you know, even if you think about 12 Years a Slave and Solomon Northrup's tale, which was, you know, a true story they made into a movie recently. And in the movie, Benedict Cumberbatch plays this kind of kind-hearted enslaver who actually gives Solomon a violin at one point and gives him days off and saves his life at one point, but also is part of this enslaving system. And I think, you know, in these systems of social control, you can have people who are kind, who are still reinforcing that system and who think they're doing the right thing because they have convinced themselves that that system of control is necessary. You know, it's rare in systems of social control that people are behaving as out-and-out villains, although that happens too. And all of that's going on in that passage, and it's being rendered in every sentence is giving you some reminder of this relationship of control between Shafa and Demaya too. And it's creepy and wonderful, I think.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I mean, like, you can be complicit in a system of control and still think that you are doing good. And you might very well be doing good. Like you said, he is taking her away from a situation in which she would probably be killed. The fact that he is removing her to a situation where she will only be killed if she can't behave does kind of make a pretty unveiled allusion to the current sort of racial politics of not just the United States, but I think that is primarily what we are supposed to see here, that if you don't toe the line, there's a place and a space for good ragas, but probably not ones for that aren't willing to quote unquote behave.
And well, in this world, from what we see, also has patriarchy too. You know, that a orogeny Cyanite is not only made to control her power and, you know, to do these little tasks, but her her body and her reproduction is controlled by the system as well. If you think about, what has been expected of women throughout our country's history, with, some relief from the sexual revolution that's now at the very heart of our politics, about who's going to control women's reproduction. That's also one of these themes too. And it gets extra complicated because the orogenies are in fact dangerous. And if the orogenies they could become sort of god enslaver demons themselves. They do have the power to do tremendous harm. And the question of what is to be done and how do you create a stable system around that it's not an easy question. There's clearly something wrong with the world as it's being described, but it's also kind of hard to imagine, given the orogenies' nature. If they get angry, earthquakes happen and people die. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine another system in its basic structures. There's elements of the system that could certainly be more humane. Like the node maintainers feels particularly cruel and evil. But, so I love the moral complexity of it, and I don't know where it's going. We do know that one of our major characters, not a protagonist, Alabaster, who's a very powerful orogeny, sees a better way. And then we also know that somebody very similar to Alabaster, the Emperor, in the beginning, also chooses to unleash, in a very deliberate way, to unleash a kind of cataclysmic event on the world. And honestly, I haven't looked this up. It's even possible that Alabaster is the Emperor. I don't.
You think that person in the prologue is the Emperor?
I think so. The person who reaches down and breaks the earth. Maybe I miss.
Yeah, I didn't pull that because the description of the Emperor is pretty impotent. And then the narrator in the prologue says these characters don't matter at all. And then we shift to that character and the Stone Eater that's watching with him.
Oh, then who? I see. Again, it's so dense, and I may have just missed that sort of camera pan.
Yeah, it does. It happens pretty quickly. But let's see. Where is it? Yeah. The Black Star is where the leaders of the Empire meet to do their leaderish things.
Right.
I love how, the cabal and the Illuminati of this planet, we see the fulcrum, which is the order of the orogenies. We don't see any of the government of the stills.
Yeah.
Which I love that normal people are called stills. It's another... her labeling and her world building is pretty top drawer.
The muggles.
It's pretty impressive.
Of this world.
Yeah, the muggles of this world. She would have had to go back to the drawing board with that one.
Yeah, another double
seems a little
G word.
light.
Yeah.
Seems a little. Yeah. Oh God, you're right. Another. The muggles and the ragas. The Amber Sphere is where they keep their emperor, carefully preserved and perfect. He wanders its golden halls in genteel despair, doing what he is told and dreading the day his masters decide that his daughter makes a better ornament. None of these places or people matter, by the way. I simply point them out for context. But here is a man who will matter a great deal. And we shift to the person who we think breaks the continent in the first few pages of the book.
All right, well, so I think you're right. It's clearly not the Emperor, but it could be Alabaster. You're this right. Man's description and it might not be, and that's part of what's going on here is that the cataclysmic world-cracking event seems to be taking place in Essun's timeline.
Right.
The other events, the other two protagonists, seem to be happening a little bit before that, or 1,000 years later, or 1,000 years before it. And it's also unclear to me whether Demaya's timeline and Cyanite's timeline are the same or separate. Right. And another possibility, too, is Demaya might become Cyanite. I mean, I think they're both described as being from the Midlands, the sort of neither the poles. They're both, I forget the term for it, but essentially orogenies who appeared away from the fulcrum and were brought in. And we know that eventually Demaya will be given a mineral name. It's possible that the mineral name that she's given is cyanite, and this is the same person.
And we also know that Demaya is really good at this.
Yes,
like
as is
the
cyanite.
The last chapter we see, she's basically bullied for being the teacher's pet. And she's really good.
She's a talented, promising orogeny, does very, very well in the school, and cyanite, probably about 30, is a very talented, up-and-coming orogeny who's achieved the 4th ring level at a pretty young age too. So they could, I don't know, they could be the same person. It didn't occur to me until I had actually read the whole section, and I went back and read the prologue and started thinking about the time frame, and that was what really convinced me. Oh, at least there are at least 2 different timelines here, and maybe there are 3, and also maybe there are intersecting characters, because these characters' destinies are going to intertwine in some way.
They have to.
Otherwise, we wouldn't. I think. Otherwise, it would be very strange novel structure.
We're in like Jim Jarmusch territory all of a sudden. I mean, which would be great, but a really strange turn for
midway through. Tom Waits starts smoking cigarettes, and it's like, you ever wonder why these earthquakes always happen at 2 a.m.?
Or like just a third of the book was in Japanese.
I know one reason for that. This is a weird aside that I don't know if I should tell you here, but one night I was drinking alcohol late into the night at a bar in Guatemala, and I met one of the funders of Mystery Train, who is a Japanese businessman who convinced, actually I think he was a government official, but he convinced either, I can't remember if he worked for Sony or if he worked for the government, but he was also friends of Jim Jarmusch, and he convinced them to give Jim Jarmusch like $100,000 to make Mystery Train. And his name's in the credits. He gave me...
That's amazing.
Yeah, he gave me his business card. He got very, very drunk and staggered home and gave me his business card. It was an interesting conversation. So that might be the reason. Which is that he was getting money from this fellow. I could figure out who this is. If we go through Mystery Train and look for like the highest level like executive producer with a Japanese name, that's the man who I met at this bar one night in Guatemala.
It's going to be Goto Dango.
It was not Goto Dango, yeah.
That would be amazing.
This man was not quite at the level. He's probably more of a like junior vice president, as opposed to, Goto Sana, head of the company.
But yeah, you're right. These characters do have to all merge at some point.
Yeah.
And I think that's the part of the book that I am enjoying the most. I'm enjoying a lot of this book. I was surprised I was really expecting science fiction.
Yeah.
We are calling this book of this set of 3 books Black SFAF.
And it won a Hugo.
It won a Hugo. I'm embarrassed to say that I know very little about the 3 authors that we're reading in this group, other than Colson Whitehead. To open this book up and realize like, oh, this is a fantasy novel. This is not science fiction.
Yeah.
Was a real like, but I love fantasy novels. It's what I grew up reading. And I mean, all those books that you mentioned at the top, Lloyd Alexander, Ursula Le Guin, Susan Cooper, I mean, those are the syllabus of my young life.
Yeah.
And I'm really happy to be back in this kind of very inventive and just very good piece of fantastical fiction.
Let me ask you, based on what you just said, what do you think about the level of density and complexity? And in particular, I'm referring to, so there's geology, and then there's kind of magic, and then there are these other sort of rock beings, and then there's also sort of architectural history. There's 3 protagonists. There's at least 2 timelines, maybe 3, maybe 4, because there's also the future generation that this is being told to. I'm also enjoying the book quite a bit. There's a part of me that's sort of like, I wonder if we could have just simplified all this a little bit. I wonder if we could have told a tighter tale that wasn't trying to do quite so much and then maybe did the things it did a little more effectively. And I'm not sure exactly where I land, because I do enjoy the mystery of it. I do enjoy that I don't really have any idea what's going to happen. I see possibilities, but I really don't know. But yeah, what are your thoughts about that? Is it in the sweet spot for you?
It's a lot. And I think that it's intentional that she's doing it, because this is a novel that is about history, deep history. Like, this has been going on for not even centuries in this world. This has been going on for millennia.
Millennia, yeah.
And any time that you are trying to do world building in a place where there has to be that kind of density of history, there has to be a lot of stuff that is unclear and that is forgotten and that is mysterious and is just plain weird.
Yeah.
I hear you. Like, just like we talked about with The Arrest, this book starts hard, and you really have to, you don't get the names of our protagonists pretty quickly. You get a series of characters that were shown and then are kind of jerked away. You get this very strange sort of Genesis moment of, we get to see one of the Stone Eaters kind of come out of a geode, and you think, is this the main character? And then it's not, and we don't even like really see anything like it for about 200 pages. But I think what she is trying to dramatize, I think she is trying to dramatize the fact that this world is very dangerous. There's that interlude where she talks about the fact that the people of this world do not look up and they don't look out. They see stars, but they certainly don't think about other worlds. And they certainly don't try to voyage across the sea. There's this terrifying thing where they talk about 100-foot tsunamis as like the little brother to the big waves that roam the ocean.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh my God,
Yep.
This is not a safe world. So a lot has been lost in this world. And we go through these things called seasons, which is a lot like George R.R. Martin's like Winter is Coming.
Yeah.
Like in the Game of Thrones world, you get winters that last for years. And you get these seasons that maybe even last for decades in some of them, where there is so much ash thrown up into the atmosphere that the world cools off and lots of extinctions happen.
Yeah.
And so everybody is unsure of the history. And I think that is what she is trying to do. That she's trying to put us in that same place of really not knowing what is going on, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. It really places this novel at the center of that moral ambivalence that you were talking about when you were talking about Control.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is that's what I think is going on. Whether or not it's enough to keep people reading the next sentence, that I think is going to be a case-by-case basis. And I could really see some people being like, this is too dense.
Well, I think your answer, I think, articulates something I think that's important clarification, because I do really love the vastness of the history of this place. And actually, one of the questions I really want to ask you is related to that. But I think maybe what I'm talking about when it comes to complexity is more the number of sort of chess pieces that could affect the plot. And in particular, I don't read a lot of fantasy anymore. I do prefer science fiction. And I think one of the reasons for that, quick aside, Orson Scott Card's definition of sci-fi versus fantasy, I saw him give a talk one time, and his definition is fantasy books have trees, sci-fi books have rivets on the cover.
He's not wrong.
Yeah, and it's it's kind of a joke, but
yeah, it is kind of a joke.
I think that I'm not terribly interested in magic as a concept because I kind of think I enjoy physics. And I enjoy, there are certain things that might appear to be magical, like quantum physics, but I like that there is a explanation rather than it's just, I learned this ancient language and then the gods chose to imbibe me with this power. That to me is, not that interesting to me. I mean, I did love Tolkien, but and so to me, the orogeny is just a little bit too close to magic. I feel like I might enjoy this book a little bit better if it were set on this planet and it were set at the sort of this technological level, but the earthquake control was sort of more a steampunk kind of mechanism, you know, like if there was some kind of like rudimentary like, oh, we have these machines that can sort of sense like that the quake starting and can deliver pressure that way or something. And the idea, but I do kind of like their magic, and I like that it's grounded in geology. But then we get the like stone demon angel things, and like I don't know that we need that, and I don't know that we need Father Earth, and it's really sort of more kind of like those elements, and that there's just a lot of different kinds of forces that can impact the world, and it's kind of like, you know, it feels more like three-dimensional chess than just good old chess. And that I'm so that's maybe more what I'm driving at. I do actually like the vastness of the world, and actually one of my questions for you about that is, I know that N.K. Jemisin has expressed an interest in stability, you know, and one of the other themes of the book is stability. And Jemisin is this old city that is not necessarily as big or as wealthy as some of the newer cities that have sprung up in the current age, but it's lasted longer, you know, because it's got this kind of like pyramid structure in the middle of it, and because they know to build their gates out of stone and not iron, and that it's essentially a city that prides itself on being able to survive seasons. And I'm curious, like, does that concept resonate? What are the equivalents in our world? I mean, I can think of one. I'll throw one out, but I think there are others. Immediately, when I think of the relationship, to say, of Jemisin to Alia, the newer city where Alabaster and Cyanite go, I think of like London and New York. You know, and London being this sort of old city that started. I mean, what? I don't even know when London started. Like, before a long time ago. Like, it was an old city in 1300 AD, right?
Yeah, totally.
And you know what London was then and what London is now is very different. And what London was then, parts of what London is now would have been a village 3 days ride away from London now. You know, it swallowed. But I'm curious what that sort of what does Jemisin remind you of, and is it a concept that has, you know, does it feel analogous and relevant in our world today?
Is there an analog to Jemisin? I wasn't thinking that way. I mean, the point of Jemisin in this book is that we learn right off the bat that it's designed to withstand seasons. And then almost the first action we see is a horrific cataclysm that you think probably should destroy Jemisin.
Yeah.
But we also know that, like, it has dealt with stuff like this before, so maybe not.
But the narrator says Essun was not in Jemisin, which is a good thing for you, otherwise you wouldn't be here. Which strongly suggests that if she had been there, she would have died.
Yeah. It is a metaphor. It's a piece of figurative language for a stability that is passing out of the world. And that it's the beginning of this new season, the 5th season,
right,
that ostensibly the rest of this book and then the 2 books that follow it discuss it. I mean, I really think that Jemisin stands for the destruction of the old order, or at least that's what we're supposed to think it is, because as we've discussed so far, this is a pretty cagey author who plays her cards pretty darn close to her chest.
Yeah.
And plays and has a large hand. I don't know what game we're playing, but it's like,
well, she says the world ends, and I mean it's almost it's like a great poet, right? Did you have it?
It's like the first line of the book.
The world ends, the world ends, the world ends for the last time.
Well, that is a T.S. Eliot poem, The Hollow Men. And that is, but she changes the last line of it. The T.S. Eliot poem goes, "This is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper." And it's ostensibly inspired by Heart of Darkness and Mr. Kurtz and all of that stuff. But she says, for the last time, this is the way the world ends. Except we know that the world continues because, like you said, you wouldn't be here if she was in Humanus. So like,
so what does for the last time mean?
Maybe this is a story about a transition from this like stable but unfair society into something better. That's what I am hoping.
I like that theory. And I think the decision of the maybe Alabaster or Alabaster-like character to kind of break the world, it would seem to be motivated by something like that. This is an angry person, but not a crazy person, I think, as it's represented. Although Alabaster might be sort of right on the edge. It also makes me wonder if part of that order, is it about simply destroying Eumenes and their control over every single sort of post-season age? Or is there something about what that character did at the beginning that also knocks the Stillness, the name of this world, out of this hyper-seismological epic? That maybe this is, how that whenever there's a big earthquake, a lot of times the seismologists will say, well, the good news is that we released a lot of tension, so we probably won't have another bad one again for a while. Was this like... to to use a upper Middlebrow was this like the Randy Waterhouse's prostate sort of release of the is this the grand release of seismological tension that this planet needed to enter a more stable era where they don't have to worry about earthquakes happening all the time anymore? Is that what we witnessed, or is it about destroying a political order? But yeah, I have to think that whoever that person was in the prologue, that what that person is doing is trying to make a better world somehow.
Yeah, I think you're right. You, in order to make a Pangea omelet, you have to break a whole bunch
of crust.
Of crust.
It's Bakunin's Pangea. We have Chekhov's, the false Chekhov gun, and now we have Bakunin's Pangea.
Bakunin's Pangea. We've had some.
We haven't mentioned
with the
Star
authors.
Wars or Larry Niven yet on this episode.
I know.
Maybe they're trying to make a ring of seismological material around the solar system. That one doesn't count. It was forced.
I want to do my reading. The reason I want to bring this up. I want you and I want the reader. I want you to count the number of times that the narrative doubles back on itself or makes some kind of claim and then undercuts that claim later. Because I really think that that's an important aspect of this book. And I think she gets that in early and does it in complex and interesting ways. Prologue. You are here. Let's start with the end of the world, why don't we? Get it over with and move on to more interesting things. First, a personal ending. There is a thing she will think over and over in the days to come, as she imagines how her son died and tries to make sense of something so innately senseless. She will cover Uche's broken little body with a blanket, except his face, because he is afraid of the dark. And she will sit beside it numb, and she will pay no attention to the world that is ending outside. The world has already ended within her, and neither ending is for the first time. She's old hat at this by now. What she thinks then, and thereafter, is, but he was free. And it is her bitter, weary self that answers this almost question every time her bewildered, shocked self manages to produce it. He wasn't. Not really. But now he will be. I think the way that she manages to do all of that in a fairly breezy tone of voice and narrate a a large personal ending that must be horrible, and set in motion so many of the themes of the book: control, ambivalence, confusion, obscurity, loss, is so amazing.
Yeah.
And then, of course, she has to bring up the concept of freedom, and the acknowledgement that in this world that you aren't free until you are dead is a really important place to begin. And the subtitle of the subtitle of the prologue, "You Are Here," with its attendance jokes about maps,
right,
and the present tense, and just sort of a existential statement. David Foster Wallace brings this up over and over again in a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again. The "You Are Here" stands in for this constant kind of imperative reminder that you are on vacation.
Yeah, it's interesting because the immediate reference I thought of was Lethem, like the sort of the multi-layered meaning of "you are here." It echoes of every bumper sticker has come true, at once. But also, "you are here." The "you" in this moment, I think, is the reader, but it's also Essun.
Yeah,
and I mean, doubling back. I mean, you have also. In this, let's start with an ending, a personal ending. So we know that we're also going to get bigger and broader endings. But then we also hear that Essun has reset before, too. And that's another thing we haven't mentioned is the second person. And maybe this is the last thing we should talk about. Did you say everything you wanted to say about that reading? What do you make of the second person in reference to Essun?
Yeah, that's a tough one. We might, okay, I'm going to make a quick run at it. That it is usually when you deploy second person, you are attempting, I just did it right there. One is attempting to kind of make the reader complicit in the action. It's both a way to make the action immediate, because the reader is like, "Oh, me? How wonderful."
Yeah,
and then,
it is the voice of the game master, right?
Yeah. Yes.
You turn down the left corridor and everything is darkness, and then a match flicks, and suddenly the walls come to light, and you can see the glittering jewels of the dungeon around you.
Yeah. Yeah, second person can be a bit of a cheap trick. It is a quick hit of immediacy that then also drags with it some real problems of craft, of keeping characters straight. And I think what she's doing here is she is acknowledging that and playing with it by continually making us wonder, like you've said, is it the reader? Is it Essun? She's certainly set up a situation in which Essun would be forgiven for having some dissolution of self.
Yeah.
And I think she is trying to do both. I think she's trying to implicate the reader. You have to in a book where the prospect of American slavery is, kind of hovering in the background and is ostensibly being read by an audience of white folk.
Yeah.
White American folk. But I think also there is a narrative thing that she is also doing, implicating Essun, and really returning her narrative to this kind of constant, you are here, you are going through this, and it's hard.
Yeah, and I agree with all of that. And there are a couple other layers I noticed this time that I've never noticed before with second person. Because I think if you had asked me what does second person do, I would have said, I wouldn't have necessarily thought of what you said, which is implicating the reader. That's a really good insight. But what I would have said is that it suggests to me that this particular protagonist feels a little bit disassociated with their self. And I think certainly like in Jennifer Egan's Visit from the Goon Squad, that is definitely the case with Bobby. He's sort of standing outside of himself, watching himself in a very tragic and sad way. I actually didn't have that effect quite as much this time. Maybe a little bit at first when she's mourning, but it continues for page after page. And after a while, I've been spending a fair amount of time alone lately, a lot, like, I'm having conversations with people, and I, visited with some friends, and I probably will again soon, but number of days where I'm really in my thoughts all day, which I actually kind of like, but it started to remind me of that sense, rather than being disassociated with myself, of kind of sinking into my thoughts in my reality the way that you can when, say, you're on a 3-day backpacking trip by yourself and the world kind of collapses. So I found that happening. And then the other thing is that, if you're writing in first person, the speaker is very clearly the character. When you're writing in second person, it raises the question of who is calling who is calling whom you. And
that sentence was almost entirely pronoun. That was amazing.
Who is calling whom? You. With the exception of is.
Yeah, that is a bad sentence. There's a to be verb, there's a gerund, there's a
Come on, man, that's badass. It had exactly two
Oh no,
parts of
it's
speech.
great. It's like
badass
it's like
sentence.
there's no there.
Indeed.
Yeah, you're in Gertrude Stein territory. I love it.
So
you're taking a bad sentence and making it great.
And I think in this case, the answer to that question is this kind of Homeric narrator. The person who's joking with us at the beginning, and you are here. And I think you've probably read more Homer than I am, and I don't know if Homer ever is playful like that, the way that this narrator is, but I definitely have this sense of gather round, wept. So, we're about to hear the story of how the world ended for the last time. And, we're going to start with a big tragedy, and then we're going to start talking about a small tragedy. And remember who you are. You are Essun. You've been other people, but right now you are Essun. And I don't know. I do feel a little bit of like the Beowulf narrator, the Beowulf poet, or Homer in that, although I don't know if they're ever quite that playful the way that this is being playful. But definitely every time I hear you, I'm imagining this sort of character / narrator of the now present telling us about how the world we're living in was born. And that's not something I'd ever really thought about before, of the power of the second person too. And so, and I think part of it is that the second person lasts for so long, the effect starts to change, and it starts to morph from that sense of disconnection to almost that sense of I actually find myself really immersing into Essun in a way that I wouldn't have necessarily expected.
And that's the immediacy that you get out of the second person. That's the thing that you go there for, because it really does seat the reader alongside the narrator and in the narrator,
as opposed to first person, where it can be kind of more like you're sitting next to them at the bar and they're telling their story. Although with some exceptions, like Andy Weir's Project Hail Mary first person feels very internal, maybe because it's present tense, and maybe because he's kind of narrating like, I see something. What is it? That he's kind of narrating thought in a way, as opposed to, sort of being like, and then I figured the best thing to do would be to hightail myself out of town in a jiffy,
Yeah, I think you're totally right that the present tense is what makes, because that's another tool of immediacy.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, is the second person here present tense, or is
yes,
it...
I think so. I think so.
Yeah, so
that's my recollection.
It is a super immediate kind of point of view then.
Yeah.
Which might be why you're feeling such a identification with Essun. I think that's intentional.
And a sense that Essun is very contained, that Essun is not particularly perceptive of other people's thoughts and experiences too. I mean, there's this moment where she's on her killing streak, where she sees a young kid and a father who's concerned, and that kind of snaps her out of it. And she has a little bit of empathy in that moment, and she realizes, oh my God, I'm acting like a monster. And she stops. And there are a few other moments like that in her interactions with the boy, Moa, where her kind of motherly for lack of a better word, instinct, and I don't mean that in a biological sense, I mean it in the behavioral sense. She's been a mother.
Yeah.
She is a mother, and she sees what appears to be a child who needs help, and her motherly instincts kind of snap in. But for a lot of times, she seems rather fixated on her experience of the moment, too.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, the only reason, I mean, she stops because she realized, like, she's being a monster because she is, she's been treated like a monster.
Right.
Like, she is in a monstrous situation where other people have been monsters to her.
Yes.
And yeah, it's that moment of empathy where empathy is supposed to lift you into a place of not simply retaliating.
It does in that moment. Although it is her retaliation is shocking because she kills the head man who's trying to help her and who's actually behaving with quite a bit of integrity and compassion in that moment. And it's tragic how monstrous she becomes, but then she does, sort of pull back from the brink. It's another observation is that there are no heroes in this book. There are protagonists.
It's complicated. Yeah, everybody's complicated.
Everybody's complicated, and nobody, maybe, Demaya and Cyanite might be the least morally compromised thus far, although what Demaya has to do in order to survive in the school is rather devious, and Cyanite is also kind of forced to make these compromises around her body and her reproduction in order to kind of gain the power that she wants to gain within the society too. So yeah, there are no straightforward heroes in the 5th season so far.
Let's move on to trivia.
All right.
Okay, as usual, I tend to ask about inspiration and author history.
Okay.
A large influence in N.K. Jemisin's work is anime, which she began encountering as a 5 or 6 year old, she says, in the 1980s. I'm going to give you 3 anime series. Your job is to select the one that she has identified as the most formative.
Okay.
Was it A, Astro Boy, B, Robotech, C, Voltron?
Okay. Astro Boy, Robotech, and Voltron. Of all of those, Voltron is the only one that I watched more than once. Voltron was basically a bunch of human-controlled fighting robots that could then also combine to form another really big robot to kind of like stop invaders from invading Earth and things like that. I think usually there would, and maybe there were some Daikaiju who Voltron would have to fight. Robotech, I believe, were mechs, which were sort of like Transformers, but a human controlled them. So like you basically control sort of like a Decepticon, except for you were in control of it. Astro Boy, I feel like the least familiar with, and it feels like the most kid-like. I do remember Steam Boy, which was much later. I just think that the other two don't quite sound like N.K. Jemisin, so I'm going to go with Astro Boy.
Here's the quote to let you know how you did. Robotech blew my mind because I saw stuff there that I'd never seen in American media up to that point. I saw heroes die, but the show kept going. I saw women warriors who weren't scantily clad or incompetent. I saw an interracial romance. Yeah, Star Trek had the first interracial kiss, but it never went farther than that. Roy and Claudia were an actual long-term healthy relationship. So I watched more anime, including some Miyazaki, and there I saw unhappy but good endings. The heroes didn't always win. The villains sometimes changed into heroes. I was used to the simplistic black and white, good and evil binary that's so endemic in American stuff, and anime's shades of gray pulled me out of that rut.
Yeah, that all makes sense. I think if I'd been more familiar with Robotech, I might have picked up on some of those themes, but
I was overjoyed to read that.
Yeah.
Robotech is a central plank of my childhood, mostly because of the role-playing game. I did watch a lot of Robotech, but I certainly read the shit out of Palladium's Robotech role-playing game.
Well, let me give you your trivia question. Okay, so in the Fulcrum, Demaya, when she's studying, one of her tormentors, who at first appears as kind of a friend, but appears to be a false friend, is a boy named Mashiche, which is spelled Maxixe. And Mashiche is in fact a mineral. And in our world, Mashiche is a gem. It is a bluish variation of beryl, which is much more common. And Mashiche has a fascinating quality that it's known for. And I'm going to give you 3 possibilities, and you need to guess which of those fascinating qualities it is. I'll say it's possible that the name was chosen because of this quality.
Okay.
But I have no evidence to support that.
Okay.
So option A, Mashiche's color is a bright kind of aquamarine blue, but the color fades if it's exposed to sunlight or even like house lights. But the color can be restored with gamma ray or X-ray radiation. That's A.
Okay.
Fading color restored with gamma rays. B, in its pulverized form, if you grind it to a powder, it can be combined with pulverized lithium and some other chemicals to create a formula for the cathode material for batteries. And some early experiments shows that lithium beryl phosphate batteries might prove to be up to 15% more efficient than lithium iron phosphates, which is the kind of batteries that most RVers and hybrids use these days too. So that could be a big breakthrough battery technology. C, if a gem of Mashiche is smashed, it actually can release a kind of mineral odor that many people find unpleasant and is said to be reminiscent of rotting cabbage.
Nice work, because now 1 and 3 could definitely... A and C could be the little hint that you gave me, that this maybe this character is named this way because of his particular traits. You know, he is a bit of a stink bomb, but he's also a little bit more of a chameleon. So I'm going to go with A.
You are correct.
Hooray!
Excellent reasoning. Excellent reasoning.
Well, I don't know if I would have gotten there without the hint.
Yeah.
But yeah, I that was a pretty significant hint. Upper Middlebrow is a Small Point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes are the Orogenies and Guardians.
How is that possible?
Music from Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by me, Chris Bagg. You can learn more about us at uppermiddlebrow.com. You can find us on Twitter at uppermiddlepod, and you can check out the birthday pictures on Instagram at uppermiddlebrow.
And hey, Jonathan Lethem, we're glad you're enjoying your new favorite podcast. This one goes out to you, buddy. Lots of love from the lads.
That's right, he did call us lads.
Yes, I like that.
I love that.
Well done, lads.